In this section, we'll talk about visualization. Now, what is visualization and why is it so important in landscape photography? Visualization can be defined as being able to form an image in your head before you're able to capture it. And it starts from the moment you frame your image and compose it and carries it all the way to post-processing and printing. Now, visualization is not something that you can just easily master by just hearing me talk about it, because there are so many different elements within visualization that you need to be comfortable with. For example, you need to be very comfortable with the gear that you're using and know exactly how it's going to function in the field. In addition to that, you need to be comfortable with your artistic side as well as the technical side. Now, you probably captured images in the past that you really liked, but you didn't fully understand what you like about them. And if that's the case, then that's probably a result of an accident, something that you did not actually plan for. Now, once you understand the process of visualization, not only will you be able to look at your own images and know exactly what you like about them, but you will also be able to look at other master photographers' works and understand that whatever they had in the image that you're looking at is made intentionally. One of the most critical components of visualization is scouting, and that's the process of you physically walking around or maybe driving around to find an appealing subject that you want to photograph. Now, scouting can be done at any point of time. In fact, a lot of photographers, including myself, prefer to do it during midday when the conditions are very poor. And the reason why you do that is because you want to be able to first find a subject, frame and compose it as you see it in your mind, and then come back to that exact same spot and photograph it with the ideal conditions. Once you identify an interesting subject that you want to photograph, you still have a number of important decisions that you need to make as part of your visualization process. For example, if I'm photographing a beautiful landscape and I have a foreground element like a flower that I want to incorporate as part of my image, I need to understand how I need to frame that flower in my shot. Is it going to be on the left side of the frame, the right side of the frame, or maybe in the dead center? Also, I need to see how close I need to be relative to the flower. The closer I get, the larger the flower is going to appear relative to the background. The important thing here is to understand that all of these are conscious choices that you make as part of visualization. Take a look at this image. Everything in it is highly intentional. In fact, as I saw the rainbow, I knew that I didn't want to photograph the rainbow by itself, and I wanted to incorporate an interesting foreground element to balance that rainbow with. And as you can see, I did find an interesting subject, which is that golden flower. Now, part of my decision-making process was to decide exactly where I want to place the flower and how big I want the flower to appear relative to the rainbow. And in this case, what I ended up doing is placing the flower on the bottom right side of the frame and then intentionally putting the rainbow on the top left side of the frame so that the two can counterbalance each other. Now, if I placed my camera closer to the flower and exaggerated its size, then it might have been overwhelmingly big compared to the rainbow, and that was not my intention. It's also important to point out that I had a very limited time window in which I had to make these quick decisions, and I knew that the conditions were so rare and unique that I wouldn't have a second shot at this image later on. Now, does this mean that visualization can never change? Absolutely not. In fact, as you're photographing the subject, the lighting might change, or you might turn around and see something more beautiful. In those cases, feel free to change your visualization. In fact, drop your initial plan and come up with a new one. In fact, you might run into situations where you're photographing a scene, then you take the image into post-processing and realize that you want to change the colors in the image drastically, or perhaps apply cropping to remove some of the distracting elements. In such situations, feel free to change your initial visualized image because that image could be improved upon. Another important aspect of visualization is identifying what your subject even is. Because if you don't do that, you'll end up with random shots that look more like snapshots. Instead, if you clearly identify your subjects in your images, you'll be able to showcase them in the best way possible. As you go through the process of identifying subject, you might find something in the scene that grabs attention, and that might be due to an object's texture, size, structure, form, shape, or even color. And in some situations, the sheer size of an object might make it appear more dominant, and that is usually your primary subject. Also, there might be other elements in the scene that grab attention and carry a lot of weight, and those could be your secondary subjects. In addition, you might have tertiary subjects, and those are usually going to be not as prominent and important as your primary and secondary subjects, but those are the ones that you do have to keep in mind as you frame your image. Lastly, you might have parts of an image that have more of a supporting role, and those are supporting elements. And the main difference between supporting elements and the first three is that you can cut into supporting elements without making the image look incomplete. For example, you might have a colorful sky or a field of grass in front of you, and those are supporting elements, such as in this image. Now let's talk about this image for a second. As you can see, I actually have two elements that are the most dominant in this shot, and those are two primary subjects, the flower and the rainbow. Now, I don't have any secondary or tertiary subjects in this shot because there's no other element in this scene that stands out. Now, this is a very unusual situation because usually you work with a single primary subject. However, in this particular situation, I have two elements that are counterbalancing each other, and I could argue that my image contains two primary subjects. Now, what are the supporting elements in this image? As I've said earlier, it's the sky and the field of grass. Now, as I was taking the shot, I knew that those two elements were an important part of my image, but I wasn't as concerned about cutting them off as I would have been with my primary subjects. Now let's take a look at a more complex example where we can identify different subjects in the scene. As you can see, I have a very prominent structure, which is that V-shaped rock, and that's my primary subject. It establishes itself as the primary subject because of its beauty and its dominance. Now there is another element in the scene that has a lot of weight due to its size and colors, and that's this bush, which actually helps me counterbalance the left side of the split rock, and that's my secondary subject. In addition to these, I also have tertiary elements in this image, and those are the bush on the bottom left side of the frame, the rock that's laying right next to it, and also the yucca on the right side. Now, these are tertiary elements, and I also was very concerned about making sure that they fit in the frame. So as you can see, none of these were cut off as part of my framing. Lastly, I have a number of supporting elements in this image. For example, the sky, the Joshua trees in the background, and the rest of the rocks. And although those three help me form part of the image, they're not as important as my primary, secondary, and tertiary subjects, which is why I had no problem with cutting them off. Now you might be wondering, what is the point of going through and identifying different subjects? Now, as I pointed out earlier, if you know exactly what subject you want to capture, you can show it as beautifully as possible to the viewer. In this case, imagine if I did not go through that process of identifying exactly what I want to photograph. I might have gotten a very sloppy image with things that are cut off. For example, this rock on the left side, I could have easily cut into, or maybe that yucca on the right side, and that would make the image much less appealing because it would look incomplete. Once you identify your subjects, it's important to note that you need to slow down during the picture taking process. And the reason why it's important is because if you don't, you're going to end up making a lot of mistakes. Maybe you're not going to have a properly leveled camera, or maybe you're going to start cropping into things that you shouldn't be cropping into. Now, in this particular example, as I've told you earlier, I had to go through the process of identifying the subjects. And then once I did that, I had to slow down with my camera and determine the exact framing that I needed to make a successful photo. If I didn't slow down, then I would end up potentially cropping some of the important elements out of the scene. And that's obviously not my intention. So how slow do you want to go? For this particular shot, it actually took me quite a bit of time to capture the image. And the reason why is because first, I had to walk around the rock to find the best vantage point where to capture it from. And second, I wanted to make sure that my framing and composition were ideal. And that alone took several minutes just to be able to capture this one shot. Now, if I didn't take the time to slow down and carefully think about what I was doing, I could have ended up with an image that was less impressive or potentially even incomplete. And that's exactly what you want to avoid when shooting in the field. Now, slowing down doesn't mean that you need to just stick to one composition that you had in mind, because if you're not going to be flexible, you might be missing out on golden opportunities. For example, if you have your shot exactly captured as you previously wanted, why stick around and try to capture more images of the same scene while the light is golden? In those situations, you might be better off walking away from your subject, finding something more interesting so that you can maximize the yield from that day. For this reason, you'll find me running around like crazy when the light is changing, because once I have the shot that I wanted, I'm going to see if I can find other opportunities. In addition, you might have a situation where you carefully frame and compose your shot to match your visualization, but then the light is happening elsewhere. In those situations, why stick around and capture an image that's not going to work out anyway? Because there might be other opportunities nearby. In those situations, be flexible, because the last thing you want is to miss out on an opportunity that might be just a few feet away from you. Lastly, let me give you a tip on visualization, and it has to do with using a tripod. Now, using a tripod is very simple because all you do is set it up and put your camera on it, right? Well, in reality, that method is not ideal because you're forcing your images to a certain height every single time you take pictures. Instead, why not shoot handheld first and compose your shot exactly how you want, and only then take your tripod and match the height of your camera. Remember, don't let your tripod dictate your composition. To sum everything up, visualization is a very important part of landscape photography, and it's not an easy topic to master. Getting to the point where you can visualize an image in your mind before you're even able to capture it takes a lot of practice, but it's something worth striving for. Once you get to that point, you will realize that the decisions that you made in your best images were completely deliberate and conscious.